Welcome to the Digital Power Peer Assessment Program Project Showcase for Cohort number 1 in our second training phase. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Stacy Erdman, and I'm serving as the project director on this project. Our peer assessment program is generously funded by an IMLS Laura Bush 21st Century Librarian Grant, and we're currently wrapping up phase 2 of this grant with our second 3 cohorts nearing the end of their work on the project. These cohorts have spent a year getting to know one another and supporting each other as they learned about and completed different digital preservation assessments, including the NDSA Levels, the DPC RAM, and the NEDCC's peer assessment framework. They will share some of the highlights of that work with you today. Tomorrow we'll hold the final project showcase event for Cohort 3. If you'd like to join us for that presentation, you can use the free registration link on our website, which I'll paste into the chat momentarily. Our grant in this project will be drawing to an end this summer with the publication of a white paper and a volume of case studies written by all of our project participants. So be on the lookout for that later. And for now, I'd like to introduce our wonderful cohort facilitator for Cohort 1, Kyle Henke.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm the cohort leader. I helped and hopefully helped and assisted everybody throughout this program. I guess, brief background on me. I'm currently the lead digital librarian for a company called All the Systems, where I do consulting and management of like digital asset management systems, preservation systems, that sort. But I have a long background as a digital archivist and like the academic and special collections and archives world. So that's where I'm coming from. And then today we're going to hear from members of the cohort. We get so there's Tia Stenson-Cunningham from the Deadwood History Incorporated, Daniella Aquino from the I always say this word wrong, Diocese of Orange, Rhonda Jones representing the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium, Katrina Thompson, Northwest American Indian Coalition, Kristy Rawson, the Chicago Dance History Project, and Tanel O'Connor from the Racine Sisters of St. Dominic. But just to kind of lead us off, Tia from Deadwood History is going to start us off. And if you want to share slides or just speak, that's your call.
I have slides to share.
Cool.
Okay. All right. So as Kyle said, my name is Tia Stenson-Cunningham. I am the archivist for Deadwood History. And so I'm going to kind of start by talking about Deadwood History. Maybe. There we go. So Deadwood History is in Deadwood, South Dakota. Yes. That one that you think of. Here at Deadwood History, we have 10 full-time staff. 3 of them are collection staff. We have our curator of collections, myself, the archivist, the digital archivist for the Fassbender photographic collection. Deadwood History also manages 5 different properties. So the Adams House, or the Adams Museum, the Historic Adams House, the Days of 76 Museum, the Homestake Adams Research and Cultural Center, and then the brothel Deadwood. And then our mission for Deadwood History is to preserve and present the history of Deadwood and the Black Hills through exceptional places, interactive exhibits, and engaging events. For our collections, we have several different collections because of the history of Deadwood History. We started out as the Adams Museum in the 1930s, and by 2012, we became Deadwood History by helping out and acquiring other historical locations and institutions in Deadwood. And so we have the Adams Museum Collection, the Days of 76 Museum Collection, the Historic Adams House Collection, the Homestake Mining Company Collection, and then our institutional records. We also have several collections that are for use, such as our Prop and Education Collection, the Centennial Clothing Collection, and then the Brothel Collection. And the Brothel Collection is items that were acquired to decorate the brothel from the 1980s that was closed during an FBI raid. And then we do manage other collections for other people, such as the Don Clauser collection for the city, the Carriage collection, which is owned by the Days of 76 Museum Incorporated, and then through a stewardship agreement with the City of Deadwood, City of Lead, and the City of Spearfish, the Fassbender photographic collection. And so within this collection, we manage them through two databases. First is Past Perfect, where we have about over 18,000 objects, it's actually now over 25,000 photographs, over 1,100 archival records, and 330 library records, which are just books that have been donated to us that are in our permanent collection. And then we also recently acquired archive space, where we currently have about 40 completed finding aids, which is about 823 linear feet of materials, which doesn't really well reflect the extent of what we have, because most of that is our Homestake Mining Company collection, which is a institution that had been around for over 126 years, and we only have about 40% of that fully processed into archive space. And so kind of gonna start talking about the issues and challenges and why I wanted to do this program. And so when I first got to Deadwood History in 2021, we only really had our network server that was generationally backed up, and then we had an external hard drive where we would hold copies of all of the scans that we would do. And other than that, there were no fixity checks. And even then, as Kristy knows, I have kind of come to discover that a lot of the scanning that we did was not saved. So once the digital image was put into Past Perfect to be a placeholder image to be like, this is what it is, my predecessors deleted those images. And then when it comes to our larger collections, especially materials through the Homestake Mining Company, when those got scanned for a research request, my predecessors didn't really think about file naming them and organizing them in a way that we could reuse them and find them for a different researcher. And so I knew more needed to be done, and part of that was inspired because we've in the last couple years we've had a exploratory mining company come look at our historical mining data to kind of so that they can get a better estimate of what gold is still in the hills. And so with all of the massive amounts of digitization we've done for them, I knew that we needed to start thinking about caring for our digital assets in a meaningful way. And so when I saw this opportunity, I felt like this was going to be a really great way for me to re-up my knowledge on digital preservation so that I could better communicate it with my superiors. And so when it comes to Deadwood History's physical media, we really don't have a lot of tools for reformatting things other than our flatbed scanners and our oversized scanner. And so one of the interesting and one of my favorite things about the Homestake Mining Company collection and its 126-year history is that they were on the forefront of technology usage, not only with like mining technology, but information technology. And so we have Bernelli drives, 3.5 inch and 4.25 inch floppy disks, and microfilm. And we don't have the tools available here to make the information on those materials accessible. And right now, I have very little knowledge of what other media types in our other collections are there to best figure out what we need to get reformatted so that it can be more accessible to our users. And additionally, other issues are the fact I am the sole archivist, and so these concerns are my sole responsibility. And as a smaller institution, and we are spread very thin, so there's a lot of things that need to get done. So I wear many hats, everyone else wears many hats, so sometimes it's really hard to get a big project done. And here at Deadwood History, we really don't have IT support. We have a consulting IT person, but he's not always the easiest to get a hold of and doesn't always answer our emails. And then, unfortunately, as any sort of group project, it's hard for everyone to meet at the same time. So there was the challenge of kind of getting to know my cohort members, and our meeting started to trickle out of the way after September. And so through this program and my experiences here, I kind of gathered 6 goals that I wanted for Deadwood history. The first one being creating a digital preservation policy. And so through my time with POWRR, I was able to complete the first draft using the resources that were provided, and it's currently under review by our executive director. The second was to find a digital preservation software, which I'll talk more in depth after this slide. And one of our whole entire goals for Deadwood history is to do a complete inventory of all of our collections to gain better intellectual control. And so with that, I'm making note of items that need to be reformatted so that once we kind of gather that inventory, we have a plan of how much and what things need to get reformatted so that we can better estimate and budget getting those put into accessible formats, and then check with what has been digitized and what hasn't, and what digitization files have been saved and what has gotten deleted, so I can better manage what needs to get done on that. And then, of course, create digital preservation workflows and document it, because even I, after a few weeks, will forget what I've done. And if I ever leave here, at least there's a system in place for anyone in the future. And then one of the things I've also worked on with my curative collections is prepare for a born digital donation. So right now we don't really get a lot of donations of modern items. And so I wanted us to, but we've gotten more feelers about that for people who are bringing us digitized items. And so I wanted to create paperwork for making sure that we are getting the proper documentation of the access level that the donors want to provide the materials. And so we've created some addendums to our deed of gift and to our loans to mark the fact of whether or not, can this be used for commercial use? Can this be used for research use? And an evaluation form so I can evaluate any sort of digital materials that comes through our door or through email. And then, of course, my final goal is to create a records management policy to ensure that all the information we should be saving in our institutional records does. With some of the turnover that I've seen in my few years here, I worry that files that should be saved have been deleted and lost. And so I want to ensure that we are keeping the files we need to, which will then help me better manage our digital institutional records. And so my primary focus has been trying to find a digital preservation software. And so for Deadwood history, our needs is I wanted something that could do everything as much as possible. Because of being a single person, having something that could do as much as possible would be helpful, and something that would need little IT help, something I could do and figure out and handle on my own. And then because we rely on research fees, something that would allow us to continue to be able to have people pay for scans, and having something with a controlled bit of access. And so with that, I first looked at Preservica because it played nicely with archive space. And so that's great. But when I looked at it closer, I didn't like its privacy and the controls that it would provide for privately or publicly sharing materials. And then it was very expensive and outside our budget. So that was something that quickly got off my radar. And so what I looked at next is called permanent.org. It is something I use personally that I discovered at a SAA conference while in graduate school. And so I like permanent.org, and it was what we went for. It is currently working on becoming a trustworthy digital repository. It is currently now starting to use Archive Medica for its background maintenance. It has redundant backups. It does fixity checks. And what's nice about it is that it's a pay per gigabyte program versus a large yearly subscription. And so that will allow us to slowly budget to add all of our digital materials to permanent.org. And the other thing with permanent.org is that it will allow you to do private sharing and public sharing, and you can turn off in the public sharing for people to be able to download the files that you want to present to them. And so one of the things that we have done already is that we have in our collections management budget, I came up with a number of about $800 that we would spend towards permanent.org to make sure that we can get everything into there in a reasonable amount of time, but also continue to have room to grow. And through permanent.org, I have goals to methodically add all files under a digital preservation policy into there. When it comes to large our Homestake Mining Company collections, that if people have large scanning requests, I can share through that, which will be a little bit more secure than like Google Drive. And then eventually use the public interface of permanent.org for the collections that we house or we manage through Archive Space. And so that was my experience with POWRR. So thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thanks, Tia. Next up we have Daniella. Daniella, feel free to take over.
Sounds good. Okay, can everyone see the slides okay? Okay. Hi, I'm Daniella Aquino. I'm the Assistant Archivist for the Diocese of Orange in Orange County, California. The Department of Archives is a religious archive belonging to the Diocese of Orange, which is the administrative center of the Roman Catholic Church in Orange County. The diocese grew as a branch of the Los Angeles Archdiocese and was established in 1976, though many of our parishes date to the late 1800s. It covers a large territory of almost 800 square miles and is the 11th largest diocese in the US. So that's a lot of land to cover for preservation. We operate under the Code of Canon Law of the Roman Catholic Church. Canon law is a code of statutes that was established by the Vatican, which governs the operation of the church. So essentially every Catholic diocese is required to have an archive that's overseen by the chancellor and then ultimately by the Vatican. Our oldest parish is Mission San Juan Capistrano, founded in 1776 by the Spanish Franciscans. And this area is home to a rich and diverse history of Native American, Mexican, Spanish, and European communities. Our archives are housed in the bell tower of the new Mission Church, which was built in 1986. And some of our collections are also housed off-site in the undercroft of Christ Cathedral. Our department has had a total of 3 staff members throughout its history. Father Bill Kruckelberg was the first director of archives, and he remained in the role from 1976 through his retirement in 2015. And then the archives was unstaffed for about 6 years until Father Chris Heath was appointed in 2021. And then I was hired in September 2023 as a part-time assistant archivist. And both Father Chris and I are very grateful to Father Bill for all his unceasing work. He really did build quite a robust archive all on his own. There were a lot of factors that led me to apply to the Digital POWRR program. Our main repository houses over 1,800 cubic feet of materials, and we have additional materials at Christ Cathedral. So you can imagine with a limited staff, as well as being unstaffed for so many years, we do have a large backlog of materials. Oh, so sorry. The lights are going out here. Let's see. I apologize. So most of our collections are not processed or cataloged, and our archive also does not have a digital preservation plan in place. We're not capturing born digital materials at this time either. We inherited Past Perfect as our collection management system. Father Bill was a historian rather than an archivist, so he collected objects and books in addition to records, so he preferred to use a museum-based CMS. And aside from local storage and Office 365, Past Perfect is the only platform used for preservation and access. We also have additional materials housed on legacy media, whose content is unknown at this time and at risk of loss. We have many additional audiovisual formats that are deteriorating rapidly, including our reel-to-reel tapes. Those are exhibiting signs of vinegar syndrome. We also will be celebrating our 50th anniversary in the next year, and we want to be prepared with digital projects and materials for that event. And then on top of all this, I had not worked in an archive for over a decade. I was working mostly in public libraries, so technology had rapidly changed in that time frame. And so I felt a little lost when I began at this position. So this lack of knowledge and resources led me to apply to the POWRR program, and I was very grateful to be accepted into the cohort. Throughout the year, the assessments were the most helpful takeaways from the program. They really did provide a guide for implementation and helped to inform our decision-making throughout the year. When I completed the NDSA levels at the start of the program, most of the areas were functioning at a 0 level. This was due partly to our status of our department, as well as my lack of understanding of all the concepts when we began. For the first few months in POWRR, I did feel very overwhelmed. I was completing the assessments and tools and keeping up with the readings, but it still felt like I wasn't grasping everything. So in late summer, I just started to start over completely from all the materials that we had from January on. And this review really solidified my understanding. And I felt like this is when I really started planning our digital preservation. So I completed the NDSA and DPC RAM assessments 3 times, once in April, again in September, and then once again in early 2025. So with this better understanding, I realized that our departments were actually functioning at a higher level than I originally thought. And we also increased our levels in some categories throughout the year. For example, after working with our IT department and discussing our backup systems, I was able to increase some of those levels to level 2. The NDSA levels were the most rapid assessment for me to use, and I like that they do provide like a nice overview of your current status. I found the DPC RAM assessment to be the most helpful. Once I really understood the concepts, I found the tool really easy to use and helpful in creating a baseline for our program. And I intend to implement this as part of our workflows and use it annually to kind of track our progress. What I found really interesting was that the organizational capabilities increased more over the year than our service capabilities. So for example, we've collaborated with other departments in the diocese and built relationships over this past year, especially with IT. And we've also networked a lot with the Association of Catholic Diocesan Archivists, which is a national membership that we belong to. So it's been rewarding to see growth in those categories, but we haven't really made as much progress in the service capabilities. So for those, I updated most of our target levels to level 2, which is basic, because I originally had them at level 4 optimized. So when I reassessed, I realized it was better to focus on having some level of preservation in place, even if we may change it over time, rather than aiming for optimal conditions. So that brings me to the peer assessment report. This was the most challenging assessment, partly due to its level of detail and the difficulty in completing it with a peer. My partner was Estee, and she was great to work with. We were a great match because we both work in religious archives. We tried to meet at least monthly, and it was really great to have someone to brainstorm with. But that being said, it was still really challenging to complete the peer assessment. We chose the co-assessment approach, and we went through the first few sections of the framework together. But at some point, we realized it really wasn't feasible for us due to our time constraints and commitments to work through the entire framework together. Again, it can be very overwhelming to go through this assessment, so we decided to complete it independently and then ask questions as needed. I liked that the peer assessment helped me to identify both potential digital collections as well as gaps in our collections. But because it is so extensive and there is a lack of a visual breakdown, unlike the other two assessments, it really does have to help to have all three to supplement each other. And I now have a really thorough report that I can provide to our chancellor for advocacy. And I've already presented it to my director so that we can use it as a guide moving forward. So as we wrap up POWRR, we still continue to face challenges. At this point, we don't have a formal preservation plan in place. And I feel less overwhelmed than I did a year ago, but it's still a daunting task with only 2 staff members. And I know the lone archivists out there are like, at least you have an extra person. One thing that's helped is that I was promoted to full-time, and so now I have more time to dedicate to digital preservation. Another challenge is the risk of loss for the unknown content stored on our legacy media. It's expensive to digitize, it's time-consuming, it takes a long time to find vendors, and at this point, we don't have a dedicated budget for digitization or digital preservation. So as we are preparing for the upcoming anniversary, we really need to prioritize these collections. For example, we just digitized a pneumatic tape that contained the dedication mass of our diocese with our first bishop. So it was like a historic mass, and to our knowledge, that was the only extant copy. So if we had lost that, it would have been devastating for our history. We also want to prioritize the digitization of our sacramental registers. So these are large books that are kept at each parish where they record the sacraments that are performed. And per canon law, these are required to be handwritten and kept in fireproof safes. So we want to survey the oldest parishes in the diocese. We have about 20 that are over 100 years old. We want to make sure that they are still kept in proper conditions. And for those that are deteriorating, we want to digitize those as soon as possible to preserve that history. I'm still a little confused about the practical or technical applications of preservation software in regards to ingest workflows, processes, et cetera. So I really need to dive further into that. And we are lucky to have a very well-developed in-house IT department. So with their help, I'm hoping that we will be able to purchase a scanner in the next few months and also review preservation software over the next 12 months. So in light of all this, Father Chris and I decided that our first goal will be to revise our acquisition policy and make sure that it really details and includes digital preservation. So we will be working on that for the next 6 months. We will also be meeting in March to discuss adding digital preservation to our budget. And we are essentially starting from scratch. So we just are focusing on immediate next steps. And I have a long list of goals for the next 3, 6, 12 months, and then for at least the next 5 years after that. But we're just kind of staying focused right now on what we can do at this moment. And we have a much better sense of where we're headed. So I just wanted to conclude with something that I heard the other day. Father Chris and I met with the archivists at the Segerstrom Center of the Arts this past week, and they shared with us their experience working in digital preservation. They've been working together for over 10 years, and they said that when they first started, they had no idea where they were going with this preservation program. And they would ask themselves continually year after year, where are we headed with this? Where is this going? Until finally one day they realized they were already on the path that they were meant to be on because of the work they had been doing little by little. So in other words, it's really just one small step at a time, just kind of progressing forward in whatever way you can. So I just wanted to give a quick thank you to Kyle and to Estee and the rest of our group and to the POWRR program for giving me this great opportunity. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Daniella. Next up is Dr. Rhonda Jones. Take it away. There.
share my screen. Not seeing where I can share. Oh, yeah. Okay. And can you all see this? Share my screen? Yeah, okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. My collection, I'm the archivist, or was the archivist, for the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. And our project, our archive was called Evidence of Things Not Seen. And our focus was about, based on our mission, to document the unique first-person experiences of the foot soldiers, for those unsung heroes and heroines in Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma. We know the renowned figures, but we also don't know who the people were who attended those mass meetings, who walked across the Edmonds-Pettus Bridge, who signed up for voter registration clinics. And so our site, the coalition is of 21 sites, and the 21 sites consist of churches, private homes, and buildings. And so, for example, about in Birmingham when the demonstrators were attacked and some were bitten by police dogs. There was a doctor, Dr. Richard Harris, and he was called the bite doctor, and he would treat some of the demonstrators who were injured. And so his home is one of our 21 sites. Now, because they are in, private ownership, the inhabitants, the owners, they are trying to turn them into private museums and house tours and things like that. So the idea was we would do oral histories with a lot of the participants, as well as collect documents and ephemera and turn them into digital objects to create our digital archive. So our archive is born digital. I joined or I applied for Digital POWRR because I really wanted to work with community archives. I have a background of academic archives, special collections, but I really think my interest is better served with community-based archives and helping communities become their own archivists and create their own repositories. And so I live in North Carolina, and I was working part-time with this group, and I was working remotely. So those were just some of the challenges, because there were a lot of standards on paper, and I'll talk about that later, but in application and theory, I still don't think they understand that they have an archive. I think they feel like it's just a website, and they've just uploaded things to the website. So, and I'll talk more about that later. So just to go through my presentation, I'll talk about our collection, the goals, and some of our challenges, and then a final analysis. And unfortunately, I didn't do a peer assessment. I had difficulty coordinating with my cohort, with my partner. So that won't be part of my presentation. But nonetheless, as I said, we have 21 sites. This is, as we know, the Freedom Ride bus in Anniston, when the demonstrators were attacked, they went to the Ballard family's home, and their home is one of our 21 sites. And so again, it's sometimes open to the public. It's inhabited by the family, but they're not really lived in. And so they're just trying to figure out in transition what they're going to do with these sites. But this is part of a larger collection. And so the idea to create and document and preserve a lot of this history and keep it local is really what's attractive about this project. And it was very well supported and very well funded. And initially it was supposed to be coordinated with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, but for some reason it was not. And so that kind of led us to finding different preservation software tools. So this is what our collections consist of: digital objects, oral histories, newspaper clippings, photographs, transcripts, ledgers, just scrapbooks, property deeds, anything about these properties. The churches, they have their own history. And so a lot of the information is about not only the religiosity of the institution, but the role of these churches in the civil rights movement. This is Richard Arrington. He was the former mayor of Birmingham, the first African-American mayor. So we have, again, a lot of the idea was to do these kind of history harvests and to get the communities to come together. It was a very community-oriented, forward-facing project. The difficulty, this project started in 2020. And so, of course, we know that was the beginnings of COVID. And so considering that most of our participants are of age, they're aged, they're susceptible to illness. And so we had to put a lot of this work on hold for a while. And so we really didn't get started until about 2022. And when I was hired in 2023, I was hired for 1 year. And so for the 1 year, I tried to make sense of all of this material. And so it's still ongoing, and it's as most archives are not completed, but it's still a project in its infancy, and I'm no longer there. So my contract ended December 31st. And with that, my access to all the materials ended. And so I don't even know if it's gone live. I'm not even sure what the status of the collection at this point. So this is our team. We had an executive director, we had a finance officer, we had regional coordinators, one for Montgomery, one for Selma, and one for Birmingham, and then we had volunteers. And so these sites were managed by volunteers. And the idea was, as they were, talking to community members and engaging stakeholders, that they would tell them about our project, they would tell them about the archive, and these people would, contribute materials. And, everyone understands the importance of documentation and preservation. Each of the sites were equipped with a flatbed scanner. They had cameras. And so, as you see, not a lot was done because a lot of the site coordinators didn't know what to do with this equipment. They weren't sure how it operated. We had trainings, there were manuals, there were toolkits, but at the end of the day, they felt like, I'm here by myself, I'm responsible for all this other work, and the archive just kind of fell to the wayside. So it really wasn't prioritized as we would have hoped it would have been. Jessica O'Connor is the project director. And then we had a graduate research student, Brucey Porter, who was very instrumental in creating a lot of buzz. And again, these individuals were in Birmingham, and I was not. So I didn't really get the opportunity to engage and interact as I would have hoped to. And I'm also a public historian. And so a lot of this work, it spoke to me in terms of community archives and public programming, but unfortunately, because I was not there in person, it really wasn't as it didn't go off as I would have hoped it would. But it was a great project. We had, again, we were supposed to work with the Civil Rights Institute. They had their own server. They did integrity checks and backups. And so we thought, this is amazing. Initially, it was just set to collect 400 items and to create digital exhibits. And when we decided not to go and work with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, that was before I was hired. I'm not sure why they decided to do that. We then had to think about, well, then what systems would we use? And so just to talk about, I'm trying to educate them about, bit level and file identification and checksums and, fixity and things like that. And it was just kind of language that was not really conveyed very well. Again, I feel like this is just a website. We're just uploading to the website, and it was so much more than that. The levels of digital preservation, again, trying to inform and educate and engage, to teach and talk about fixity and metadata. The buzzword metadata is data about data. Like, it's so much more than that. Trying to understand that the metadata is about, almost tied to the description, like, what is this? What is the object? And is there a date? And can you identify? And what do we know about this material, so that if someone is looking for it, they will be able to find it? And, a lot of, and I'll talk about that in my challenges, a lot of the materials were not identified. There was no, we couldn't figure out a unique ID system. It was just a lot of miscommunication. Let's see. Yeah, again, talking about the importance, telling them, teaching them the importance of metadata. We talked a lot about which preservation system we would use. I mentioned to them Preservica. I was familiar with that. They weren't happy with Preservica archive space because we used it at the university. Archmatica, and then collective access. And so the project coordinator director her background was museums. And so she was really interested in content management system that would create and design digital exhibits. And so we ended up going with Odyssey. And so we chose Odyssey, and, it came with staff that were, on hand. And anytime we had a question, they were very good about getting back to us. And so I think for the staff, no one had access to this material except for the three of us, the coordinator and the graduate student and myself. And so the staff, I think initially we had the idea that it was going to be like crowdsourced and everybody would be able to upload and contribute information, but we just decided to restrict the user roles and restrict access. And so my main concern with this project was we used SharePoint. And SharePoint I didn't think it was very flexible. There were problems with ingesting the materials. There was a problem. We were trying to use OHMS, the oral history metadata synthesizer, and it didn't communicate with SharePoint. And so we abandoned OHMS, and we ended up using a lot of, we used Adobe products and Google products. And so it was, we were looking for things that were open source, but that was one of our main hindrances. So we went with Odyssey, and midway through our project, and this is kind of the timeline. Again, my contract was 1 year. So I started in June, and, we kind of gone through, we ingested materials. And then when the contract, right before it ended, we ran out of storage space. And so our space with Odyssey was to capacity, and the project just stopped. And then we had staff turnover. The regional coordinators were no longer employed. And so there was, a big void. And so everyone was kind of scrambling and trying to do other people's jobs. And the archive just kind of came to a screeching halt. So at that point, we got an extension. The grant was funded by IMLS, and we got some additional funds, and then we increased our storage. And so when we increased the storage, I was able to continue on ingesting and describing and creating content for the archive. And that, again, it was in one of our challenges. So the initial challenge was, again, with OHMS, and then OHMS became Avery, and Avery was not open source. You had to pay. And so we didn't go with that. We had some hardware failures. My scan disk, it was, the port was damaged. And so a lot of the information was lost. Data corruption. We had contractors who were doing the oral history videos, the audio videos, and their software wasn't compatible with SharePoint. And so when you would try to download it and then upload it and ingest it, the files couldn't be read. I remember talking to the coordinator at Odyssey, and I said, well, it's uploaded, it's here, I can see it, but every time I open it, on the back end, it's saying that the file can't be read. It's damaged. And so she's like, well, I don't know. And I was like, but, is this checksum? Isn't this fixity? Isn't this what we're trying to see? Making sure all the bytes and everything are correct. And I didn't think it was very helpful. And I just ended up having to re-ingest a lot of our videos. And so that was very time consuming, just trying to get videos to load. And that was an issue. The fact that our cloud storage was at capacity, and even now it's at capacity. We have 561 items, and we have 2 digital exhibits, which are taking up a lot of space. And so, it was kind of like my suggestions were unheeded, and, I did what I could. There was also an issue of lack of description and accompanying metadata. Had to create a lot of that and kind of go back, and it made a lot of work for myself. And the fact that, we did have external storage in addition to SharePoint, but it was the project director had access, and when I needed something, our files did not coordinate. And so a lot of information she had, then SharePoint was full, the capacity with SharePoint, and the finance officer was complaining about, you're spending all this money on storage and we don't have the budget for that. So then the program coordinator removed everything from SharePoint before I had a chance to put it in Odyssey. And it was a lot. And just the organizational risk, lack of training, staff turnover, their policies, they're on paper, but I don't think that they're really the procedures are being adhered to. Lack of succession plan. I don't see now that I'm gone. I think they just feel like it will be cheaper to have an intern who can just add to the website. And I created an inventory, I created a finding aid, just trying to show them that this is just not a website. This is for research purposes, and this is for preservation. Funding instability, lack of training and expertise, and just risks about moving forward and long-term succession plans. And in my final analysis, again, we had 561 items, oral histories, transcripts, documents, photographs, manuscripts, ledgers, newspaper clippings, and ephemera. I'm not convinced that the digital objects were scanned at the proper DPI. I mean, all those policies and plans and measures that we had, students were doing it and volunteers were doing it. So whether they were being observed and there was some checking behind it, I wasn't there, I don't know. But on paper, we have some well-defined policies for a digital preservation plan. And we understand our community stakeholders, and we understand our purpose and our mission. And we are very good about that. Rights and copyright, things like that, because it is open source, because it is for the public, we have no restrictions about, whether the collection could be used for research purposes. You can use the collection and materials any way that you like. So we have 5 collections: Evidence of Things Not Seen, Notable Women of Selma, Balm and Gilead, Untold Tabernacle, and Voices of Alabama. And again, they're all, these 561 items are distributed within these 5 collections. And for the digital preservation, these were my recommendations. I suggested to them that they download this. That was the last thing I did before I signed off. And hopefully they will, because again, there's really no long-term plan for preservation and capacity. And I don't know if the project director is going to do this work moving forward, or if they're going to hire a permanent archivist. I don't think they feel like they have enough material to warrant someone full-time. So I think they feel, we'll just add as we gather. But I'm not seeing any kind of outreach that they are trying to get more materials. So yes, and so thank you so much. This was a very interesting work for me. I'm really grateful to have the guidance of Digital POWRR. I just wish that my projects could have been more collaborative, and I wish I was almost there with them, because I think it could have gone a little bit differently. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. We were going to have next up was Katrina Thompson. She's under the weather. So we're going to, Katrina from the Northwest American Indian Coalition. She's a little under the weather. So hopefully we're going to have her record a session later, and we can, add it, splice it into the whole recording once it's put on YouTube for Digital POWRR. So with that said, next up is Kristy Rawson from the Chicago Dance History Project. Kristy, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everybody. I do not have slides. I have an outline I'll be reading from, so you get to look at my face and my messy bookshelf behind me instead of slides. But hopefully everything will be pretty clear without the visual aid. So yeah, Chicago Dance History Project was established in 2015. I didn't come on until 2023. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the challenges that I've dealt with are things that happened in the years prior to my joining the organization. So what Chicago Dance History Project was founded to do was mostly around collecting oral histories. There were dancers and dance enthusiasts in the community who felt like the history, most of the people that were involved in the founding of the organization, it was 4 founding board members. And they were mostly active in the 80s, in the dance community in the 70s and 80s. And they felt like the history was kind of going away and Chicago wasn't really getting the credit that it deserved as a really robust sort of center for various forms of dance. And so that, as people were aging and in danger of passing before their stories could get recorded, that was kind of the foundational thrust of the organization, was to capture these histories orally. One thing with sort of the sense of urgency, as they always described it, that mission was undertaken. Preservation and public access to the histories was kind of on the back burner. So it was more sort of like there was a lot of collecting, but there wasn't much preserving or presenting or sharing. So the organization conducted oral histories, also some panel discussions and sometimes recorded events. So it was predominantly a born digital archive. And then as people were interviewed, they would have, almost inevitably, they would have photographs, old programs, playbills, etc. And it'd be like, oh my gosh, this is a wonderful collection. We'll have to archive these as well. So we continuing to have the archive completely digital, we would temporarily hold items. They would be digitized for preservation and returned to the person who donated them. That was a pretty haphazard process. There was never really an accession plan. And so as I sort of came in later and started to see the various degrees of documentation around all of these collections, I kind of started to think more of it as sort of like a digital hoarding process than an actual collection. So a lot of what I've been working on is trying to sort of, I'm collections manager is my title, operations and collections manager. So actually collections isn't even all of my job. So I have been learning since 2023 about what's in the collections, how it was collected, how it potentially could be understood, and trying to understand what to do with the items that were collected with less of a clear agenda at heart. So to get back to sort of the organizational history, the board members started with 4 founding board members, like I said, and 1 executive director. The staff consisted initially of just 1 digital production manager, and he would do the videoing, and then they would get interns. So the interns were always working during the summer. They were unpaid. And so there was a digital archivist intern, there was a digital production intern, and things tended to be kind of loosey-goosey because the interns did so much and then they would leave. And so certain things would be inventoried and other things wouldn't be. Presently, let's see, I'm getting a little off track. So that went on for about 7 years under that structure of just the executive director, the production manager, and the interns. And then one of the interns became a communications person, and that person mostly would handle social media, and which was the main way that the interviews got carried to the public were either on our website or through social media, and the social media linked to Vimeo. So we had interviews, clips of interviews available on Vimeo. Actual full-length interviews were almost completely not accessible to the public. And so the clips would be handled by the interns, and everything was stored on Vimeo or on external hard drives, and everything that was not, that were not interviews, that were not born digital, also would be digitized and held on external hard drives, some inventoried and some not inventoried. The board was very interested in dance history and not very interested in digital preservation. So there really wasn't anybody kind of looking to see what was going on until the former executive director got NEH funds to have an assessment done in 2022. So I came on in 2023, and what I had was the assessment that the former executive director had contracted to get conducted. But shortly after I came on, and I was just the operations manager at that time, shortly after I came on, that executive director left. So we had me, the productions manager, the board looking to do a search for a new executive director, and this assessment that was conducted about these collections, which at that time I didn't even have access to. So I had to, through legal processes, actually gain access to the collection, gain access to Salesforce, which was where all of our metadata was collected and held, and try to make sense with this document I had, which was the assessment, and these piecing together of the materials that I hadn't actually been given access to when our former executive director left, to try to pick up the pieces and figure out where to go from here. What was initially the plan that the board had approved from the former executive director was that the entire collection was going to go to the Jerome Robbins dance archive in the New York Public Library. And what I needed to explain to the board in order to keep the job that I had recently gotten was that if we gave away the archive to the Jerome Robbins Library at the Jerome Robbins collection at the New York Public Library, we wouldn't have an organization. We wouldn't have anything. We can't give away the store. So with this assessment, I had an understanding that even though the Jerome Robbins dance curator had shown a great interest in this collection, the metadata wasn't there. It wasn't going to be migratable. There was no way that we could just pass it along to them, and there wouldn't be any way that they could integrate it into their digital asset management system because we just simply didn't have the metadata in any kind of organized format. So as we went through the search to get a new executive director, and I went through the assessment to understand sort of, where basically the gap analysis of what we needed to do to enable public access to the collections that we had, much less preservation. We developed a relationship with the Newberry Library in Chicago. So that was a huge relief to me and to the rest of the organization that we could at least have a target going forward that I could work towards as collections manager. And that is when I applied to the POWRR program, because I was like, okay, we have this, we now have a goal, which is to migrate our data, metadata and born digital items to the Newberry Public Library, but I need to know how to do that. So the thrust of my sort of goals and to implement going forward as a part of this program was that migration. And what happened was an actual inventory and a more robust assessment of the collections took place in stages while we migrated the files to the Newberry. So just as the Chicago Dance History Project had always prioritized the oral history interviews in terms of preservation, and everything else was sort of a scattershot hoarding process, the Newberry Library also was mostly interested in the oral histories. So what I was able to do was extract the metadata out of Salesforce into an Airtable database that we could design to coincide field-wise with the data asset management system with the Newberry Library, which is a very robust Cortex, Orange Logic Cortex system. So we are, and that was quite a process. But that part is happening. So about half of our interviews and panel discussions are now available on the Newberry Library digital page, which is really great. And at the same time, and this is so we have the part of our preservation that we've outsourced. You know, I can feel comfortable that the interviews that are now in their dams are preserved and held, and kind of almost like not even our responsibility anymore. But we're still maintaining on our website the ability to curate, or the plan is to curate certain exhibits, to continue to share clips on social media. So we need access and preservation copies on our end, as well as what's held in the Newberry. So the internal preservation process is still sort of in progress from our end. So it's still, for the most part, well, it's still completely held in external hard drives and on the cloud. The next, so in the course of doing that, both the NDSA levels and the rapid assessment model were super helpful for me, mostly in sort of understanding what I needed to explain to other people, and then giving people a tool by which to understand that. So in terms of communicating with the digital archivist at the Newberry Library, just going through those processes were super helpful. What I had found looking at the NDSA levels that our previous assessment, the archivist who had done the previous assessment, was that she had, to a large extent, relied on what the former executive director sort of told her about sort of the level of preservation. So everything wasn't quite accurate. And also we had such a wide range of sort of preservation levels depending on what we were talking about. So like we had fairly robust systems in place for the interviews. We had certain collections of photographs and other ephemera that was like, you know, just completely, you know, items undescribed, not dated, no file names. So I ended up doing rapid assessment models for several different collections. So different photography collections that we had, and different programs and playbills collections that we have. I've been working on getting different assessments so that I can work with the Newberry on what is actually migratable and what is really probably never going to really be fully migratable. So we have put a hold on bringing in any new collections other than continuing to record interviews. We're not taking on any more photographs or ephemera until we have a system in place where we decide sort of what it is we're collecting and why we're collecting these items. And that kind of brings me back to my my role, how I see it, and my interest in Chicago Dance History Project in the first place. So I identified with a lot with what Rhonda was saying. I'm about community archives. I'm not a dancer. I am not a dance aficionado. I have a PhD in cinema history and am very interested in musical theater history. And I'm very interested in Chicago history. So my interest in Chicago dance was as a lens on sort of the socioeconomic, cultural histories of Chicago, and how dance as a function of cultural history could shed light on Chicago history. And so I feel like there's a real, you know, a real rich archive of possibility for making meaning for the community around dance history in the context of Chicago history, but we're not doing that yet. So as part of the assessment, I've sort of decided that I've pushed the other staff and board on thinking about broader policies at the same time that we're thinking about preservation policies. And I've gotten a lot. So we ended up making a connection with a researcher who's doing research on dance rehearsal space and dance space in Chicago as a function of urban planning and a function of Chicago economic policies. And so she's looking at sort of how, for example, the movement of Joffrey Ballet from New York to Chicago, how that was upheld in the community by the city and by city resources, whereas some of the South Side, mostly African-American dance companies would come in times of hardship and would move from location to location because things would happen to their rehearsal space and happen to their ability, you know, hinder their ability to continue. And so we've been doing, we've had her as a fellow within our archive, really helping me to get one lens on how we can use Chicago dance history as a way to understand Chicago history more broadly. And then in that same sort of spirit, increase our audience from the Chicago dance community to the broader community locally and larger about understanding cultural history in urban settings. So until we sort of have more of a robust structure in place for who we're working with in the community to kind of move forward in certain identifiable ways of making meaning, we're not just going to start continually taking on anything that everybody says, oh, I have all these old pictures from when, you know, I used to take dance classes at the school or whatever. So at the same time that I've been sort of pushing around preservation processes, I've also been pushing the organization around larger policies. So it's been a lot, and this program has really, it's really helped me feel like I didn't just have imposter syndrome. I really kind of was an imposter. I came in as an operations manager, and I really needed to make the case that I could be a collections manager. And I had the will from understanding public archives. And, you know, I had a great deal of sort of on the outside looking in understanding of what digital preservation and, you know, digital humanities, as we used to call it back when I was finishing up my degree. But I didn't have quite the vocabulary or the confidence to speak with a great deal of credibility on how we needed to approach these collections. And so this has been really transformative for me to be, I guess, taken seriously in this position and being able to sort of really put forward a vision that the organization, you know, really hasn't had. So so in the just the last thing I want to say in this sort of broader idea of sort of like, who are we collecting for? What kind of meaning are we trying to be able to offer to the public? We're putting together an advisory council And I have the support of this fellow who works for the Chicago United. Her project works with Chicagoans United for Equity. So we're using like a Chicagoans United for Equity framework, racial equity framework, to bring together an advisory council that will help advise us on some of these larger collections policies and presentations policies, and how we can help promote community conversations with our archives. Now that they're going to be public through the Newberry Library and we can share them, we want to contextualize them in ways that become meaningful for other, people besides just dancers who, like to see old videos of their dances. So, yeah, that wasn't exactly where I planned on ending, but it seems like that works.
Yeah, no, awesome, Kristy, that was great. And then, yeah, so last up, make sure she's in here, but Estee O'Connor from the, my mind just blanked, the Racine Sisters of St. Dominic. Estee, I know you're, oh, cool, you made it, awesome. Take it away.
Thank you. I did have to run today. This morning I did an oral history recording with some of our sisters, so that was really exciting. But I did not intend for it all to fall on the same day, but sometimes you just can't get around that. So I am the first lay archivist, so the first non-sister to be the archivist for the Sisters of St. Dominic. We are based in Racine, Wisconsin. And as you can see from our logo there, have existed for quite some time. We started with 2 women who traveled from Germany to the United States. And the idea was that they would be teaching the children of German immigrants. And they tried many different ways, many different places to settle down, to find both the greatest need, but also where they could do the most good. And that's something that has stayed with them over the past 160 plus years. So they started in Williamsburg, they went south to Tennessee and Kentucky, but ultimately, after trying even further north than where we are now, ending up in Racine. So the first 40 years were just focused on existing. There were anywhere between 4 to 20, then back down to 10 sisters, because we had just become a state, and where the sisters were teaching in these very small rural communities, life was really tough, and medicine was not that great. At some points, they didn't even have enough funds to pay for food, and they were relying on their community members, the parents mostly of their students, to keep them going. But once the 1930s came along, they really were established enough to start thinking, we need to start saving all of the material that has been going on for the past, by that point, 80 some years. And so we had 2 Mothers General who really were the founding, not archivists, but the founding members of our archive. And they made sure that each sister out on her mission, which is whatever she was assigned to do. So that might be teaching. It also might be supporting the sisters who were teaching. So at that time, we had 2 different classes of sisters. We had domestic sisters and teaching sisters, and they worked together. They were viewed equally for the most part, but one supported the community and one went outside of the community to teach. And Mother Emily Acker is really the one who made it mandatory. And back then, if the Mother General told you you were doing something, you were definitely going to do it. That's not the case these days. So when I continue her tradition and ask for annals, for example, which is a reflection on the past year of what have you done, what were your challenges, your griefs, your sorrows. Back then, everyone submitted. These days, not so much, which is why I've pivoted and I've made sure there's many different opportunities. So what I was working on this morning was an audio recording. So some sisters, whether it's because of age or just preference, were not physically able to write their annals, I gave them a space where they could speak and have a conversation, and that was really helpful. But going back to the 1930s, it was Mother Emily who made sure that every book, every letter, and even every document which the foundresses had were saved. And so because of that, we still have the original recipe books, the original prayer books from the convent in Bavaria that was brought over to the United States, and that really was the formational documents for our congregation. When the archives were formalized as not just a collection of random things that were saved, but started to be put into order, into finding aids. You can see the Hollinger boxes behind Sister Sophia. We made sure that all of the mission documents were saved, which is the beginning of our collections. So initially, it was each location had details on names, addresses, pastors, school years, and then also the personal side of things. So when they were in their small communities outside of the mother house, they also recorded their entertainments, different programs that they had, people who visited, and incidents of importance. And these documents are really valuable from a modern perspective because they offer context for events that we know about today, but don't think about on a community individual level. So a good example of that would be, I was opening up a mission book from a local school. It was just based on a request that someone had put in for their third grade teacher. But I was going through it and I found the day that JFK was shot. And the sisters wrote about how it impacted them, how it impacted the community, what they were saying to the children. And it really, it broke up the mission booklet, but it also was just treated as another day. Before that, they had details on who was being naughty and who was being good. And then after that, they recorded about a community fair that was going on. So they're really interesting slices of life that were going on back then. So we then get into a little bit more of modern times, and the sister on the left, Sister Shirley, she was the last sister archivist before I was brought on. And she is actually still here and has been a really helpful transition, because in bringing computers mostly into the archive, we have a lot of material, legacy material, that is not easily transferred. We have, for example, a lot of Excel spreadsheets that are not editable or cannot be created. You can't create pivot tables out of them because they're from such an old version. The same thing with Microsoft Word. And actually, when I started and I was going through what was now my desk, but previously had been Shirley's, there were lots of manuals from how to use Microsoft PowerPoint 2000, how to use Microsoft Word 2001. So there were changes to be had, but I'm really grateful that it was recognized before it was too late. We have a lot of discussions amongst the religious archivist group that I'm a part of about how too often we as professional lay people are not brought in until the sister archivist passes away. And that can be really tough because there's a lot of nuances to an archive that has not been professionally set up, which is not to say that it's not well organized or well cared for. It's just that these sisters over the years have not been, they didn't go to school for library sciences or archives, but they did get support from the community, and it was important that they went to conferences, they read up on all the latest material. And so I did walk into an archive that was done so by the book that if there was a typo in that book, it would have been followed to the T. So it means that there are some redundancies, but overall, I had a good base to come into. Previously, I have started on projects where, much like some of the other presenters, yesterday, you get presented with a moldy closet full of documents in boxes that are haphazard, no labeling, nowhere to start, and it really can seem like an impossible task. But this definitely was not the case, and there was a good base of material to work forward with. So I was hired because of two things: time for Sister Shirley to retire, but also they knew that with the digital program that needed to be implemented, it just wasn't something that could be started without some sort of experience. The photo on the left is a picture of a recent service at the chapel, and you can see the sisters are aging. There's about just under 80 of them left, and half live at Siena, which is our campus that you can see on the right. And the other half are still out in the world working on mission or living with family members. But there is still a lot of material that is being generated. So it's not just digitizing and making sure that you have a digital program, fixity checks, all that sort of stuff for the existing material. It's also ingesting the new born digital material. And that's something where right now there's so many documents that have just been lost from, say, the late 1990s to probably the present day, because making sure that these born digital documents don't just disappear is difficult. I think that's something we're all facing, and in fact, why POWRR has been brought about. So what we had to work with is quite a lot of physical records. We have some artifacts that were brought in because the mother house changed locations, which I'm sure many of you have experienced. That suddenly we got to up and go, and who knows what's going to happen to the materials, but a lot was saved. And then 1.83 terabytes of digital material. And this is really where Tia's presentation spoke to me, because a lot of the scanned materials were not, ours were saved, but they were not saved in a way that could be easily accessed in the future. So something would be scanned, it would be saved because, well, we took the trouble to scan it, but any sort of reference number to refer back to either the finding aid or the physical spot in the collection was not recorded. And then there also were not standardized scanning or digitization guidelines. So I knew that was something that we needed to bring into the new program with my hiring. We also have some sister art, which truly we are not touching at this time. It is stable. It is not in danger of floods, fires, bugs, any of that sort of thing. So until we get a handle on the more used records, we're not really going into that. And then the community statistics, that's something that I right away identified as an important place to start within POWRR, because these statistics are some of the most important information that if something happened, we would need this information to reform the community. So when I'm thinking about disaster planning, or in the future when the community has come to completion, which is sort of an internal term for when all the sisters have passed away and we are no longer a living congregation, what is the stuff that has to be kept? That if we do not have this material, we cease to exist. And so these are the documents in Excel files and Word files that I was really surprised to see were in editable form. So if something happened, if someone accidentally pressed Control-Z or overwrote something, that's just sort of it. And there are lots of binders of printed out materials of those same statistics, but they're not updated, and it would be hard to reconstruct from that. So that is one of the reasons that I applied to POWRR. I had worked with digital materials before, certainly, mostly from a museum's collection standpoint, but also it had not been a big focus in my graduate program. So I was interested in getting well, I love academia, so I wanted to learn, but also making sure that it was a program that I would be doing with others, with the cohort, to have a sounding board, because I was interested as a lone arranger, working in a basement, no windows, to have other people to bounce things off with and make sure that even just for peace of mind, you know you're doing the right thing, but to hear that from other people and to learn what they're working on is always very useful. So that was the biggest drive. And we do have a lot of underrepresented communities in our archives, which I think was a key part of my application, because the sisters work with communities that have the most need. So whether that is a financial need, whether that is location-based, they went to a lot of very rural places in the United States and in Latin America. We had sisters who were they were teaching in schools that only had African-American students where no one else would be teaching them at the time. And they provided boarding, they provided food, community education. It wasn't just 9 to 5 for a school day. They were really part of the community and making sure that everyone was involved. So once I started in POWRR, the NDSA levels were the most important tool that we went through, I think, for us. But in addition to what everyone else has said about the NDSA levels, something that I haven't heard yet that was useful is that it really made me question my assumptions and get down to the very basics to make sure that we were set up the way that we needed to. So when we started, or when I was hired, I was going through that just under 2 terabytes worth of material. And I assumed, because it was networked, that it was saved in multiple different locations, that the backing up and storage of materials was not as important of a priority because it was already done. And I quickly realized after talking to our IT that that was not the case. We had a lot of materials just on an external hard drive only, for fear of filling up the networked drive or the cloud. And then we had materials that were on the drive, but they weren't backed up to a second or third location. So making sure that we went really back to basics were things that I, as more of a millennial, just sort of assumed was a baseline. Of course, we were doing this, did not end up being the case. I was lucky enough to have an adventurous IT professional. He is freelance, but does answer emails, does show up regularly. And he has been working with us in the archive, which has been great. And for some reason, he has taken a shine to our archive over others, because I recently met with another local archivist in the Racine community, and we were discussing content hosting platforms, and he had installed archive space for us. I mentioned that to her and was told that he said to her that he would not do archive space again because it was so difficult to set up for us. So luckily we were able to get that installed, and it has been really useful going forward, because right now we just have a lot of paper finding aids that are again in these Word, or they were in these Word editable documents. The peer assessment, I will agree with everyone else. It was a little overwhelming in the scope and scale, but I really enjoyed doing it for the connections that I made through it. So as Daniella mentioned, we were partners, and it was great to have another religious archivist, because I also was new to the private religious archives. Like I said, I came mostly from a museum background. I did have some experience as a researcher in religious archives, but not as someone creating these records, processing, ingesting, all that sort of thing. So we had a lot of similarities, but also just the camaraderie. It is a different sort of atmosphere to be working with people who these materials and this subject matter is truly their whole life. It's what they've dedicated their time, their talent, and it hits a little bit differently. You also have a different level of commitment where if something needs to be done, they will stay from sun up to sundown. And there's a little bit of a transition between someone hired and contracted, and I'm certainly very dedicated to my job. And I think it brings me personal gratification to be doing what I think is valuable work. But I also, at the end of the day, I clock out, I go home to my family, I have other interests. And so managing those sorts of things, it's just a little different. So talking to someone else who understood that was great to have. Improvements, I hoped that we would have more time spent on software. And I say that with the caveat that, of course, there are so many different possibilities that could be its own POWRR program in itself, is teaching people about these different options and how to use them. But I was a little disappointed that we didn't spend more time on that. That being said, I worked on that on my own and with individual questions with Kyle, and I think we came out with the right software for us. But after watching the presentations yesterday from the other cohort, I just added this slide and the next one to pre-answer some of the questions that Stacy is likely going to ask for the Q&A. So that being said, advice for future participants, you'll get out of the program what you put in. So as Tia mentioned, our meetings sort of trickled off at the end of the year, and it was harder to get people together in one batch, but I found a lot of value in coming to the program with specific questions that I thought were really not quite useful to anybody else, but in discussing them, it sparked discussion and brought, I think, value to other participants. So one example of that is I was trying to figure out the best way to go forward with some sort of email archiving that would not take up my entire job. And that is the scope that most online email archiving, whether it's webinars or classes, seem to be focused on, is these large institutions like Harvard, where they have someone whose whole job is email archiving. And I just needed something where we are no longer losing these born digital materials. I was able to pitch to our leadership that this needs to be focused on because in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, we have more ideas and understandings about the day-to-day of that executive team, which at the time would have been the priorists and sub-priorists, than we do today, because everything that they wrote down got saved, filed, shelved, and we know how to take care of paper over many decades. But those same decisions, meetings, questions from the current or recent past, those just have gotten lost. As people cycle in and out of leadership, their digital files are deleted, they move on, and that's sort of it. So I came up with a couple ideas and wasn't quite sure how to go forward. So talking to Kyle about the different opportunities and options that we had was really helpful. And just to hear that, yes, you are going in the right direction, that does make sense. And ultimately, just for anyone else who's watching this, if you are facing the same problem, we decided to have the executive team themselves set up a folder for the emails that they think need to be saved. Because one of the problems I was grappling with is making sure that we did not include personal data in saving their email drives. A lot of places recommend just saving en masse, which forget about spam email aside. But these, and in our community, the leaders do not distinguish between their personal email and their work email, because as sisters, their work is personal. They live in community, they work in community, and there's no reason to have a president email when Sister Marianne is the president and you would come to her about a personal issue or a mission-based one. So by asking the sisters to select themselves, it is likely that we will lose some material that probably empirically we should have saved, but it solves the much greater issue about saving too much or extraneous personal information. And then the second part that it was helpful to have a cohort to bounce this off of was, then what? Once we have this material saved, how do we go through and process these hundreds of emails, thousands of emails from 4 women in leadership that will just never end? And so it was good to get some reassurance from Kyle that you don't have to do that. I'm going to make sure that it's saved. I'm going to make sure that we perform fixity checks so that nothing is lost, but that will be something that we're sort of kicking down the road for 2 reasons. One, at some point I can apply for and get a grant specifically for this email archiving, or 2, I'm just hoping that I can wait out the development of software that will help do this work. So by this way, I've been able to make sure that the material, the Born Digital material, is not lost, but also make sure that it doesn't overtake my day-to-day job, which is full to the brim as it is as a solo archivist. So that is my experience in POWRR. I would say overall, it was not what I expected coming in, but it certainly has been a valuable experience. I came away with some very tangible things that I could work on in the archive, as well as a little bit more philosophical. The readings were really useful to just start thinking about different things to implement, even if I don't have the bandwidth or the ability to do so right now. So that wraps up my presentation. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. That is the cohort. I know we've gone over time. So if anybody is around and would like to ask questions, Stacy, myself, and possibly some of the cohort members can stay back. Otherwise, thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you, everybody. I have a question, actually, to just get it, while we're waiting for other questions to come in. I'm just kind of curious, and some of you hit upon this in your presentations, but what would you characterize, I guess, as your biggest takeaway from the program? Like, what do you think is going to benefit you the most, like, for your career in general?
I feel like some of the advocacy readings that we did were helpful because they gave me tools to communicate with my superiors the necessary need, because like in my hierarchy at Deadwood History, it's myself and then our curator of collections. Oh, you can't actually see me. So it's like myself, it's my curator of collections, and then it's our executive director. And so being able to with all of the resources that were provided, I can now effectively and hopefully clearly communicate what our needs are and the available options that will work within how we function here at Deadwood History.
For me, it is knowing that I'm helping to bring our repository up to industry standards, because we are basically just analog based at this point, and helping to move forward in that sense is probably my biggest takeaway. Like, it feels very historic in a way. So I really appreciate having all these tools to actually put a plan in place and start moving forward.
Yeah, I feel similarly. I do have a plan in place now, which actually includes a lot of stuff that I kind of thought I was going to be done with by now. But what I have is a much greater understanding of what needs to be done and how to explain that to the people that I need the support of. Because what I'm also finding is there's a lot of things that I'm up against that I can't do myself. So, you know, partially for just policy, you know, sort of policy structures, organizational structures, and partly financially, you know, that I need to work with a lot of people in order to make the changes that really need to be made. And as I said before, this gives me the credibility in their eyes, but it also gives me the confidence and the knowledge to be able to explain exactly what's needed. And yeah, I don't even think I realized the extent to which, well, I know I didn't realize the extent to which it was, you know, the archive that I inherited was really sort of run by, you know, kind of along the idea, you know, the standards of a hobbyist. And so taking it to a professional level has been has needed to happen in a variety of different frameworks, but definitely if it's from the preservation framework, this has just given me, you know, tools that there's no way I would have had a year ago.
I think for me, when I did my initial assessment of my collection, I didn't have a lot of the preservation paperwork, the plans, and I just recently acquired them. And so I'm confident that I think if someone who prepared them did a really good job. And so I think if they apply them and they kind of had a better understanding, I think the collection will do well. I wish I had that information before before I started this project and started the digital POWRR program. But I was happy to see it, and I was just thinking, wow, you know, this was reinforced a lot of what we were reading and what I was working on, and I feel like I you know, reduplicated the wheel because it had already been done. I just didn't know about it.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm not seeing any questions, and it sounds like people are having to dash off, so I guess we can wrap things up. But I want to thank you guys, like
Thank
our
you.
attendees who came, but also especially thank Cohort 1 for all of your hard work and in the program, and we look forward to reading your case studies. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank
And
Thank
thanks,
you
Tia.
all.
I forgot
Thank
to
you.
thank my partner Tia in doing my presentation. Tia was great to work with.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.